In Uncanny X-Men, several weeks ago on Muir Island, we see the grave of Scott Summers, aka Cyclops. As the ground begins to rumble, a beam of kinetic energy emerges from the ground, and we see Scott Summers clawing his way out of his grave. You see, several years ago, Scott was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when Scott observed a big-ass robot destroying the city. Scott suits up and begins to engage the robot, but as he's fighting the robot, he notices this old man in the distance with a sensory helmet. Scott notices the old man appears to be controlling the robot, so as Scott is fighting the robot, as soon as he gets the chance, he blasts the sensory helmet off this old dude's head. The kids in the area thank Cyclops for his service, and then they go on to tell him that the bad guy was actually a professor named Tavin Tierney. The kids tell Scott that the professor was expelled from the university for essentially being a weirdo. One of the kids Cyclops saved name is Paul Doig, and Paul goes on to tell Scott that if he ever needs anything in the future, let him know. 10 years later in Boston, Massachusetts, as Paul Doig is going to his kitchen for a little late night snack, he meets none other than the mutant known as Cable. Paul lets Cable know he's going to call the police, but Cable tells Paul he's already cut the phone lines and disabled the alarms, so he's really not calling anyone. Paul tells Cable that he has kids, but Cable's not here for any of that. Cable's simply here to request a favor, as Paul did promise Cyclops a favor 10 years ago. See, Cable has a Phoenix cage that was used to contain the Phoenix Force, but he needs Paul to rebuild it. Luckily for Cable, Paul is actually a fucking genius, as he was top of his class at MIT, and he just so happened to work for Tony Stark once upon a time. Cable gives Paul the Phoenix cage to repair, but he tells him it needs to be much smaller, like much smaller. Cable takes Paul back to Muir Island 2 years ago as they observe the Xmen gathered around the grave of Scott Summers, mourning his loss. Cable goes on to teleport Paul to the actual body of Scott Summers. Obviously, Paul asks, if that's not Scott, then who are they burying? Cable says Emma Frost perverted his memory to incite a war between mutants and Inhumans. Several months ago, we flash back to the second time Scott Summers died, as he's embracing Jean Grey. Unfortunately, Scott Summers is fried by the Phoenix, but he knew he had this coming. On Muir Island several weeks ago, we see Scott Summers crawling out of his grave as he's greeted by none other than Cable and Paul Doig. Back at Cable's safe house, Scott explains how it feels like a dream, but it wasn't a dream. Cable explains that the Phoenix Force brought him back in an attempt to convince Jean Grey to stay with it, but she was too strong for it though. Paul Doig goes on to thank Cyclops once again, as if Cyclops never saved him all those years ago, he would have never had the wife and son he has today. 1 week later, we see Cyclops still at Cable's safe house, explaining how he needs to go see Jean. But Cable says he can't do that as he's not ready. Meanwhile, at Lancaster Maximum Security Correctional Center, someone has gotten out of jail, and that someone is none other than Professor Tavin. Tavin returns to his home, and he goes down to his secret lab that's still intact, as Tavin has plans. Meanwhile, Scott and Cable argue, as Cable explains you've been brought back, and everything that happened never should have happened to you in the first place. Cable finally concedes, and he goes on to tell Scott that he's just emotional. Cable also goes on to tell Scott that right now the X-Men are fighting on an island in Canada, and it's essentially an all-or-nothing battle. But at the same time that's going on, Professor Tavin has mobilized an army of robots to kill Paul Doig. So now Cyclops has a decision to make. Go assist the X-Men who might be okay without him in the first place, or go save Paul Doig, the man who repaired the Phoenix Force and brought him back to life. As the robots close in on Paul Doick and his family, Cyclops makes it there just in time to annihilate the robots and put an end to Professor Tavitt once and for all. The next day on Quadra Island in British Columbia, we see Cable and Scott standing on the beach. Scott is reminiscing on their fight with the Avengers as the first punch was thrown right here on this beach. Scott was furious back then because after a lifetime of trying to protect humans and show humans they can all coexist as humans and mutants, Scott had to make a decision. So he made the decision that everyone else made. He chose to put his species above theirs. But Scott knows he was wrong. Now Magneto might disagree, but no matter, Scott makes a vow to find the X-Men. To be continued.